Captain James Murdoch had seen storms before, but this was impossible. The Lighthouse logbook described a tempest of unimaginable fury on December 12th, with winds that could make seasoned sailors weep. Yet his own ship's log from that exact same day recorded calm seas and clear skies. Two official records, two different realities. One terrifying truth: 3 lighthouse keepers had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only contradictions and an extinguished lamp that should never go dark. The office air was thick with the dust of forgotten ledgers and the damp chill of a Scottish December. Outside, a persistent, miserable rain wept down the window panes, blurring the view of the port into a grey watercolour of masts and smoke. Inside, the world was small, contained and orderly. It was a world Captain James Murdoch understood. He stood before the harbour master S-cluttered desk, a telegram held loosely in his gloved hand. The paper was a flimsy shield against the weight of the old man S words. Murdoch was a man carved from the same hard granite as the coastline he sailed. His uniform was immaculate, his posture rigid, his face a study in professional composure. Yet, for the first time in a long time, a current of unease ran deep beneath the calm surface. 3 nights, James, the harbour master said, his voice a low rumble, not a flicker. The mail steamer Arch Tor was the first to report it. Passed on the 14th. They expected to see Thomas Marshall S. light and saw only black rock and blacker sea. Murdoch S. gaze drifted to the map on the wall, a web of shipping lanes and hazards. His finger could trace the route to Eilean Mor from memory. The Flannan Isles, a lonely tooth of rock 20 miles west of Lewis, home to 3 men and one of the finest lamps the Northern Lighthouse Board had ever built. Thomas Marshall is the best keeper on the books, Murdoch stated. It wasn't a question. Ducat and the new man, MacArthur, are solid sailors. They know the procedure. That's what S tying me in knots, the old man sighed, running a hand through his thinning white hair. It is not just a lamp, James. It is Marshall. In 15 years, his light has never failed. Not for storms, not for sickness. Nothing. It is an unprecedented failure. He leaned forward, the dusty light catching the worry in his eyes. No ships lost, thank God. But it is a dark time of year. We can have a blind spot in the Hebrides. Murdoch folded the telegram with precise, deliberate movements. His mind worked through the possibilities, a checklist of rational explanations. The mechanism could have failed. A gear stripped, a fuel line clogged, or sickness. All 3 men at once would be unlucky. He didn't allow himself to finish the thought. Unlucky is right, the harbour master grunted. Your mission is simple. Take the Hesperus. Get out there. See to the men. See to the lamp. Whatever it is, fix it. Murdoch gave a single, sharp nod. We'll sail on the morning tide. Fix it. That was a command he understood. A broken machine was a puzzle of iron and brass. Sick men required medicine and transport. Every problem had a logical structure, a solution waiting to be implemented by a steady hand and a clear mind. As he stepped out of the office and into the cold, wet air of the port, Murdoch felt the familiar comfort of a clear objective. There was a problem on Eilean Mor, and he was the man to solve it. The Hesperus was a workhorse, not a racehorse. She shouldered her way through the choppy, slate-grey sea with a stubborn, dependable rhythm. The sky was a mess of bruised clouds, the colour of an old wound, and the wind had a spiteful bite to it. On the bridge, Captain Murdoch kept his binoculars trained on the churning horizon, his posture unmoved by the vessel's pitch and roll. He was a fixed point in a chaotic world. His first mate, Eilean, was a different sort altogether. A good sailor, but young and still tethered to the stories of his home islands. He paced nervously, casting glances at Murdoch and the unforgiving sea in equal measure. The old men, they have a name for that place, Eilean said finally, his voice barely rising above the groaning of the ship's timbers. They don't call it Eilean Mor. Murdoch lowered his binoculars, his expression unreadable. "Oh? They call it the other country," Eilean continued, rubbing his hands together as if to ward off a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "They say things are different there, that the island doesn't like visitors, that on a clear day you can hear sounds on the wind, whistling some say, crying, say others." Murdoch raised the binoculars back to his eyes, a faint, dismissive smile touching his lips. He scanned the horizon, a line of grey meeting a darker grey. "It's called Superstition, Eilean. Fishermen's tales to scare the competition away from the good grounds. You put a man alone on a rock for months on end, with nothing but the wind and the gulls for company, and his mind will start to play tricks. It is psychology, not phantoms." "With respect, Captain," Eilean pressed, his voice earnest. "My grandfather swore he saw a boat with sails of pale fire crewed by men with no faces sail from that island. He never fished these waters again. And I expect his competitors had a very profitable season that year," Murdoch replied curtly, his tone shutting down the conversation. He had no time for such nonsense. The world operated on principles of physics, of mechanics, of human biology. Fear was a chemical reaction. Legends were a form of oral economics. Every mystery had a rational core, and the mystery of the extinguished lamp on Eilean Mor would be no different. It was a failure of equipment or a failure of men. He would find which it was, he would correct it, and he would sail home, leaving the ghosts to the fishermen. Still, as he stared out at the empty sea, he couldn't entirely shake the image of a boat with sails of pale fire. After hours that felt like days, it appeared. A jagged black silhouette against the bruised sky, Eilean Mor. The Hesperus dropped anchor in the relative calm of the island's eastern lee. The engines fell silent, and a profound quiet descended, broken only by the mournful cries of gulls and the restless surge of the sea against the cliffs. From the deck, Murdoch surveyed the scene, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. The place felt wrong. There was a stillness here that was deeper than mere silence. The keepers knew the schedule. They should have seen the smoke from the Hesperus miles away. The relief vessel's arrival was a major event in their isolated lives. There was no St. Andrew's cross flying from the flagpole, a breach of protocol that sent a prickle of unease up Murdoch's spine. No one emerged from the lighthouse to greet them. The landing dock, a scar of pale stone at the base of the cliff, was empty. The supply crane beside it was motionless. "They should be out," Eilean whispered, standing beside him. "They're always out." Murdoch's face was grim. He refused to give voice to the disquiet that was now a palpable thing in the air around them. "Perhaps they're all inside, asleep." Even as he said it, the words sounded hollow, absurd. 3 veteran keepers, asleep in the middle of the day, with their lamp unlit and the relief ship arriving. He turned to the crewman at the rail. "Sound the horn." The order was given. The ship's steam horn unleashed a deafening blast, a deep, resonant cry that rolled across the water and smashed against the black cliffs. It echoed, bouncing back from the rock face, a lonely, desperate sound, searching for a reply. And then it died. The echo faded, devoured by the immense silence of the island. There was no answering shout. No figure emerging from the lighthouse door. Nothing. Just the endless, indifferent churning of the sea and the cold, silent stare of the stone tower. The central mystery was no longer a report in a dusty office. It was here. It was real. And it was utterly, terrifyingly silent. The echo of the ship's horn faded into the oppressive quiet, leaving only the sound of the sea chewing at the rocks. For a long moment, no one on the deck of the Hesperus moved. They stared at the silent tower, a granite tombstone against the grey sky. Captain Murdoch was the first to break the spell. His voice was steady, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Eilean, with me. We're going ashore." He didn't wait for a reply. The small dinghy was lowered into the water, and soon the rhythmic creak of oarlocks replaced the silence. As they approached the landing stage, the sheer scale of the cliffs became apparent. They were monstrous, a fortress wall built by nature, and the lighthouse perched atop it seemed impossibly remote. Murdoch and Eilean stepped onto the stone pier. The air was heavy and cold, thick with the smell of brine and damp, ancient rock. Above them, a set of steep stairs, little more than notches carved into the cliff face, snaked their way up into the mist. They began the long ascent, their boots ringing out on the stone, the sound immediately swallowed by the vastness of the place. The churning sea below was a constant, hungry roar. Murdoch's eyes missed nothing. He was an investigator now, his mind cataloguing every detail, searching for a pattern. He paused halfway up, his gaze fixed on the supply crane. The thick ropes were coiled perfectly, each loop laid over the last with a sailor-esque precision. It was a small thing, a mundane detail, but to Murdoch, it was a significant piece of data. Panic did not coil ropes. Men fleeing for their lives did not stop to tidy up. This was evidence of order, of a deliberate, planned action. He filed the observation away, another piece of the puzzle. Whatever happened here, it began with order. The main door to the lighthouse was a thick slab of oak, studded with iron. Murdoch put his shoulder to it and pushed. It swung inward without a sound, unlocked. This was the second violation of protocol, and it was far more serious than the uncoiled ropes. A keeper would no more leave his lighthouse unlocked than a captain would abandon his bridge. The air that greeted them from inside was frigid and still. They stepped from the biting wind into a tomb-like silence. They were in the small circular room that served as both kitchen and living area. And it was here that the orderly puzzle in Murdoch's mind shattered into 100 jagged pieces. On the simple wooden table sat a half-eaten meal, a plate of salted mutton and cold boiled potatoes, a fork resting beside it as if the diner had been interrupted mid-bite. Beside the plate, a wooden chair was overturned, its legs pointing accusingly at the ceiling. It was a scene of sudden, violent departure. Eilean, his face pale, muttered a quiet prayer under his breath, his hand instinctively making the sign of the cross. But Murdoch did not pray. He became a machine of observation. His scientific mind, his belief in a world governed by cause and effect, became his shield against the creeping dread. He stepped closer to the table, his eyes narrowed. He leaned down, sniffing the meat. Cold. The fat had congealed, but there was no hint of rot, no sour smell of decay. "They haven't been gone long," he said, his voice low and clinical. "A day, 2 at the most." He then turned his attention to the wall, where a pendulum clock hung silent. He carefully opened the glass face. The hands were stopped at 1:05. He didn't know if it was day or night, but he now had a potential timeline, a fixed point in the chaos: interrupted meal, overturned chair, stopped clock. The evidence pointed to a sudden event, an emergency that had sent at least one man scrambling from his dinner. It was a theory. It was logical. It was something to hold on to, but the contradictions were already beginning to pile up. If there had been an emergency, a mad dash out the door, why had that door been left unlocked behind them? Murdoch left the unsettling tableau of the kitchen and moved toward the sleeping quarters, a small curved room containing 3 simple bunks. Eilean followed a pace behind, a nervous shadow. The sight that met them in the bunk room only deepened the enigma. The beds were made. The coarse wool blankets were pulled tight and folded with military precision. The room was tidy, everything stowed in its proper place. It was the absolute antithesis of the chaos in the kitchen. How could a man flee his dinner in such a panic that he overturned his chair, yet his bed remained as neat as a pin? Murdoch's eyes scanned the room and fell upon the pegs on the wall. There were 3 sets of heavy oilskin coats and boots, the standard foul-weather gear for the keepers. 2 sets were missing. The third, belonging to a man named MacArthur according to the stenciled name above the peg, remained. The questions in Murdoch's mind began to compound, each one chipping away at his composure. So, 2 men, Marshall and Ducat, had put on their gear to go out into what must have been terrible weather. Why? An emergency on the landing? Something wrong with the lamp? It was possible, but why would they leave the youngest keeper, MacArthur, behind? And if the weather was so bad that it required 2 men in full oilskins to venture out, why in God's name would they leave the main door of the lighthouse, their only shelter on this godforsaken rock, unlocked? It didn't make sense. The facts were at war with each other. A frantic departure and a tidy room. 2 men dressed for a storm, 1 left behind, an open door in the face of a gale. Murdoch stood in the center of the cold, silent room, surrounded by the ghosts of questions for which he had no rational answers. The neat, logical world of cause and effect was beginning to unravel. Leaving the cold, tidy bunks and their silent, conflicting testimony, Murdoch felt a surge of frustration. The clues downstairs were a tangled knot of contradiction, a story that told of both panic and precision. It was an equation with no elegant solution. He needed a prime mover, a single, undeniable fact that could anchor the rest. There was only one place left to look. He turned from Eilean, his face set like stone. "I'm going up." The spiral staircase was a narrow iron helix winding up into the core of the tower. With each step, the world outside fell away, replaced by the cool, curved stone of the lighthouse walls. The air grew thinner, cleaner, smelling of salt and metal. He emerged into the lamp room and stopped dead. It was like stepping into the heart of a giant mechanical jewel. The great Fresnel lens, a crystalline beehive of polished glass prisms, stood magnificent in the center of the room. It was designed to capture every stray photon from the lamp within and focus it into a single, life-saving beam, visible for over 20 miles. The brasswork that held it all together was polished to a mirror shine. The gears of the rotating mechanism were clean and freshly oiled. Murdoch ran a gloved finger over a cog. Not a speck of dust. He checked the reservoir. It was full of paraffin oil. He inspected the wicks. They were perfectly trimmed, ready for the match. Everything was immaculate, perfect, ready, and dark. This, more than the overturned chair or the half-eaten meal, struck Murdoch to the core. This was the keeper's sacred duty, the entire reason for their existence on this forsaken rock, to maintain the light, to keep it burning. For this mechanism, this beautiful, intricate system of order and life-saving science, to be in perfect working order but unlit was not just a failure. It was a sin. It was a complete dereliction of everything Murdoch and any seaman believed in. It was the deepest kind of wrongness, a professional heresy that spoke of an event so profound it could make a man forsake his own soul. He descended the stairs with a new, grim purpose. The mystery was no longer just about 3 missing men. It was about discovering what could possibly be powerful enough to make them commit such a final, unthinkable act of negligence. Back in the kitchen, the cold silence seemed to mock him. He ignored Ian's anxious hovering and began a systematic search of the room. His methodical mind, which had been so thrown by the contradictions, now had a singular focus. Find the record. There had to be a record. The Northern Lighthouse Board demanded it. Every event, every drop in pressure, every pint of oil used was to be logged. His search was disciplined. He checked shelves, opened cupboards, ran his hands along the joins in the wall paneling. And then he found it. Tucked into a small alcove beside the hearth, almost hidden in the shadows, was a thick, leather-bound volume, the Lighthouse Logbook. He pulled it free. It was heavy in his hands, a solid, substantial object. He placed it on the table with a reverence usually reserved for a nautical chart in a storm. His face was a mask of grim determination. Here it was, the primary source, the ground truth. No more superstition, no more contradictory clues. Just the facts, written in plain ink on paper. Here, the puzzle would finally be laid bare. Eilean watched him, his anxiety a palpable force in the small room, as Murdoch opened the cover. The first entries Murdoch read were a balm to his rattled nerves. The handwriting, belonging to the principal keeper Thomas Marshall, was neat, the language formal and precise. December 7th. Barometer at 29.8 and steady. Wind from SW, force 2. Lamp cleaned and lit at dusk. All in order. Murdoch nodded to himself, a small, satisfied gesture. He pulled his own ship's log from his coat pocket, flipping it open on the table beside the keeper's log. He ran a finger down the column of his own observations. It all aligned. The weather patterns, the wind direction, two separate records telling one single, objective story. "See Eilean," he said, a measure of his old, confident self returning. "This is how it's done. Facts, observations. The weather was calm. The lamp was in order. Everything was normal." He read another entry aloud. December 9th. Supplies checked and inventoried. Oil at 90%. Rations plentiful. Morale good. He felt a profound sense of relief. He was on solid ground again. The chaos of the scene around him began to recede, replaced by the comfort of written, verifiable data. The keepers were professionals. They had a system. This logbook was the key, the rational thread he could follow through the maze. All he had to do was keep reading. Hours passed. The grey daylight outside the small windows began to fail, and Eilean lit an oil lamp, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. The only sounds were the rustle of pages and the low, constant moan of the wind, which was beginning to pick up. Murdoch read on, his brow slowly furrowing as he moved deeper into the final days. Then he reached the entry for December 12th, and the world stopped. The neat, orderly script was still Marshall S., but the words it formed were from another reality entirely. December 12th. Murdoch read aloud, his voice a low, disbelieving whisper. "Storm, the like of which I have never seen, came on around noon. Severe winds, though I have never felt such a storm with no wind. The sea is quiet. We are praying." Murdoch stopped. He blinked, rereading the sentences. A storm with no wind. The sea is quiet. It was a paradox, a physical impossibility. "What does that mean?" Eilean asked, his voice trembling slightly. Murdoch didn't answer. He kept reading. "MacArthur is weeping. He is a seasoned mariner, but he is weeping. Ducat is quiet, his face like stone." His hands shaking almost imperceptibly, Murdoch quickly flipped back through his own ship's log to December 12th. His own handwriting was clear, his own scientific instruments precise. The entry read, "Seas calm, wind light from the NE, sky clear." He looked back and forth between the two books. His own log, a record of scientific fact, and the Lighthouse log, a record from a veteran keeper. Both were primary sources, both were supposed to be objective, and they described two completely different worlds. One reported a calm, clear day. The other reported a terrifying, impossible storm that could make a hardened sailor weep. Science was in conflict with itself. The logbook, the rock of factual certainty upon which he had built his investigation, had just described a phantom. And for the first time in his life, Captain James Murdoch had no rational explanation at all. The two logbooks lay open on the kitchen table, a testament to two irreconcilable realities. One, Murdoch's own, was a document of calm seas and placid skies. The other, the keeper's, was a dispatch from a world of impossible tempests and weeping men. For a long moment, Murdoch could only stare, his mind a storm of its own, trying and failing to bridge the chasm between them. The oil lamp flickered, casting his shadow, long and distorted, against the cold stone wall. Eilean watched him, silent, knowing that his captain had just sailed off the edge of his own known world. With a deep breath that did little to steady him, Murdoch forced his gaze back to the keeper's log. He had to see it through. He had to know how the account ended. He continued reading, his voice now a low, disturbed murmur that was barely audible over the rising wind outside. The neat, professional script he had admired earlier was gone. In its place was a frantic, spidery scrawl, the letters slanted and sharp, as if carved into the page by a hand trembling with fear. December 13th. he read. "We are all three praying now, in the heart of this great gale. The beast is on the sea. Such a sound outside. A call. Thomas says it is a call." Murdoch paused, his own blood running cold. A beast? A call? This was not the language of a lighthouse keeper. This was the language of myth, of madness. The logbook had transformed before his very eyes, from a scientific record into a religious tract, a fever dream of three men trapped in the dark. He read the final, desperate entry. The handwriting was so agitated, it was almost illegible. December 15th. Storm end. Sea calm. God is over all. And that was it. The next page was blank, and the next. The book was silent. It offered no explanation for the two missing oilskins, for the unlocked door, for the abandoned meal. It simply stopped, leaving a chilling, ambiguous statement of faith hanging in the void. What had happened after God was over all? Had they found salvation, or had they simply been erased? The logbook, which he had trusted to provide answers, had only given him a more profound and terrifying question. The next morning rose cold and clear. The wind had died down, and a pale, watery sun did its best to lend some colour to the grey rock. The clarity of the day felt like a cruel joke after the psychological fog of the night. Murdoch knew what he had to do. He had to exhaust the scientific method. He had to search for physical proof, for any tangible evidence that could either support or refute the keeper's mad testimony. He and Eilean made their way to the western side of the island, to the landing stage that faced the open Atlantic. This was the most exposed point, the place where a great storm would have left its most brutal signature. Murdoch's eyes were sharp, scanning every inch of the scene with the precision of a forensic analyst. He was searching for the scars of a great wave, the kind of rogue titan of the sea that could, in theory, rise up and sweep three men from the cliffs. He expected to find smashed supply boxes, splintered by the force of the water. He expected to see the iron stanchions of the crane bent or twisted, the rock face itself scoured clean or newly fractured. He found nothing. The supply crates were neatly stacked, covered by a canvas tarpaulin that was still securely tied down. The crane stood untouched, its ironwork showing only the faint blush of sea salt rust, not the trauma of a physical blow. The cliff face was a tapestry of old lichen and weather stains, with no sign of recent damage. The physical world stood in silent, pristine defiance of the keeper's written account. "This is where it must have happened," Eilean said, his voice full of a strange mix of awe and fear. "A wave. It must have taken them from right here." "Look around you, Eilean," Murdoch snapped, his frustration finally boiling over. "Use your eyes. There was no wave. There was no storm. Nothing here has been touched. It's as if they were never here at all." He had reached the absolute limit of his method. There was no more evidence to gather, no more data to analyze. The scene was clean. Too clean. In the face of a complete lack of physical evidence, the keeper's story, as mad as it was the only one that remained. The absence of proof had become its own terrifying kind of proof, leaving only two possibilities on the table: a shared vivid delusion or something else entirely. That night, a real storm came. It arrived not as a phantom, but as a physical roaring entity, throwing itself against the island with a savage fury. The wind howled around the lighthouse, a living voice full of rage. Rain lashed against the glass of the lamp room like thrown gravel. Murdoch was alone in the kitchen. Eilean and the other crewmen were trying to sleep in the bunk room, but Murdoch could not rest. He sat at the table, the logbook open before him, its mad verses illuminated by the unsteady glow of the oil lamp. He was a man possessed, reading the same impossible lines over and over, as if sheer force of will could wring some rational sense from them. And then he heard it. Beneath the deep-throated roar of the gale, there was another sound. A high-pitched, thin, whistling note. It seemed to weave in and out of the windless howl, an eerie, flute-like cry that slid under the door and chilled him to the bone. He froze, his head snapping up. The sound was unnervingly familiar. It was the whistling Eilean had spoken of, the sound of the island's legends, the call of the phantom whistler. His heart hammered against his ribs. For a terrifying second, the superstitious world of his first mate felt more real than his own. He looked around the small, lamp-lit room, suddenly feeling like a specimen in a jar, observed by something old and unseen. Then his training, his entire being, rebelled. With a surge of angry resolve, he stood up. His eyes darted around the room, searching for the source. He traced the sound to a window where the old wooden frame had shrunk away from the stone. A tiny crack, no wider than a shilling, was letting in the wind, which vibrated against the edge of the wood to create the unholy sound. A natural phenomenon, a simple, physical explanation. With methodical, almost violent precision, Murdoch grabbed a spare rag from a hook. He folded it tightly and jammed it into the crack, pushing it in with his knife until the whistling sound was choked off, silenced. He stood back, breathing heavily, his knuckles white. He had found the ghost and stopped its mouth with a rag. He had imposed order. He had won. But as he stood there, in the now quieter room, with the storm still raging outside, he felt no victory. He felt only a profound and terrifying vulnerability. The sound had a rational explanation, yes, but for one terrifying moment, he had believed otherwise. The fear planted by the logbook had taken root, and he knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that he was now trapped on this island, fighting not just a storm, but the slow, insidious unraveling of his own mind. The victory over the whistling wind was hollow. Murdoch stood in the kitchen, the howl of the real storm outside a constant, deafening roar. A loose shutter on the floor below began to bang against the stone with a frantic, percussive rhythm, a maddening counterpoint to the gale. He couldn't leave it. An unsecured fixture was an invitation to disaster. It was a problem to be solved, a small piece of order to be imposed on the mounting chaos. Pulling on the one remaining oilskin coat, MacArthur's coat, he unbolted the heavy oak door and stepped out into the maelstrom. The force of the wind was a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. Rain drove down in horizontal sheets, stinging his face like needles. He clung to the iron railing, making his way down the exterior steps, the stones slick and treacherous beneath his boots. He found the loose shutter, its wood splintered, and fought to secure it against the gale. It was as he fumbled with the rope that he saw it. For a split second, the moon broke through the swirling clouds, casting a sickly, phosphorescent light on the sea. The water was a heaving, churning mass of black mountains. But one of those mountains was moving faster than the rest. It was rising, growing, swelling into a liquid cliff that blotted out the horizon. It wasn't a wave, it was an aberration, a monstrous perpendicular wall of dark water, impossibly high, impossibly steep, rising from the deep without reason or warning, a rogue wave. He had read about them in obscure maritime journals, dismissed them as tall tales, exaggerations of frightened sailors. But this was real. It was a terrifying, awesome display of nature's raw, unpredictable power. It was not a phantom. It was not a beast from a madman's log. It was pure physics, operating at an extreme that defied all normal expectation. He had just enough time to flatten himself against the cold, hard stone of the lighthouse before it hit. The wave didn't crash. It exploded against the base of the island. The sound was a deafening, grinding roar, the sound of the world breaking. A plume of white water, dense and heavy as liquid concrete, erupted hundreds of feet into the air, completely engulfing the lower half of the tower. Murdoch was drenched, blinded, the sheer force of the impact vibrating through the stone into his very bones. He had his scientific explanation. It was terrifying, it was chaotic, and it was more than real enough to sweep 3 men into oblivion. He scrambled back inside, bolting the door behind him, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The tower itself seemed to groan, a low, resonant shudder that vibrated up through the soles of his feet. The storm outside was no longer just a storm. It was the physical embodiment of the terror in the logbook. The wind shrieked through the stones, and in his mind, it was the call of the beast. He didn't know why, but he started to climb. Up the winding iron staircase, his feet clanging, his breath coming in ragged gasps, up, away from the churning sea, towards the sky. He burst into the lamp room at the top of the world, the glass panes rattling in their frames as if they might shatter at any moment. Here, in the disorienting dark, trapped and alone, with the tower shuddering from the impacts of the waves below, his scientific detachment finally broke. The carefully constructed walls of his rational mind crumbled into dust. He was no longer Captain James Murdoch, investigator for the Northern Lighthouse Board. He was a small, terrified creature, trapped in a stone tube while the world tried to smash it to pieces. He finally understood. He understood in his bones, in the primal marrow of his being, how 3 men could lose their minds in this place. He understood how the howl of the wind could become the shriek of a monster. He understood how the shudder of the rock could feel like the footfalls of a god. He understood how men could weep and pray and scribble frantic, mad verses in a logbook. In the heart of the storm, the line between a real wave and a phantom beast, between a high wind and a supernatural call, simply ceased to exist. There was only the overwhelming, all-consuming terror. He was no longer solving their mystery, he was living it. Weeks later, the office was silent. The air was sterile, smelling of floor polish and old paper. 2 grim-faced men from the Northern Lighthouse Board sat opposite Captain Murdoch at a long, polished table. The world outside the window was calm, orderly, a world of ledgers and regulations. Murdoch's voice was flat, emotionless, a monotone recitation of facts. He delivered his official report. He spoke of the signs of a hasty departure, the missing oilskins, the state of the lamp. He did not speak of the impossible storm in the logbook. He did not speak of the whistling wind or the terror he had felt in the dark. "It is my conclusion," he said, his eyes fixed on a point on the far wall, "that the 3 keepers, Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur, were carrying out their duties on the western landing during a severe, unrecorded westerly gale. In the process of securing the supply crane or a storage crate, they were struck by an unexpectedly large rogue wave and were swept into the sea. Their disappearance is a tragedy, but one attributable to the unpredictable and overwhelming forces of nature. It was a plausible, rational, and scientifically sound explanation. It was an elegant solution to the equation. The board members accepted it with solemn nods. The case was closed. Murdoch stood, nodded once to the board, and walked out of the silent room. He had given them their answer. He had given them a story that made sense, a story of science, of waves and wind. But as he stepped out into the pale afternoon light, he knew that he would forever be haunted by the real story. The story of a storm with no wind. The story of a beast on the sea. The knowledge that sometimes the most rational explanation in the world cannot even begin to cover the terror of the truth. He had survived the island, but he had left his certainty there, a 4th casualty on that lonely, unforgiving rock. The story of Eilean Mor leaves us with a neat, scientific answer: a rogue wave. It's a terrifying, plausible explanation for how 3 men could be swept from a cliff. Case closed. And yet, does that answer feel complete? The official report erases the most haunting parts of the mystery. It doesn't account for the logbook entry about a storm with no wind. It doesn't explain the keeper's psychological terror, the weeping, the frantic prayers, the belief in a beast. These details create a different kind of truth, not a scientific one, but an emotional one. It's the story of what it felt like to be there, a truth born of isolation and fear. Captain Murdoch lives this conflict. He witnesses the rogue wave, giving him the perfect rational explanation. But he also experiences the terror inside the lighthouse, a moment where the shrieking wind and his own fear blur into the same phantom horror the keepers described. In the end, he files the simple, clean report. It has the story that fits the known world. But the story that haunts him is the one that doesn't. This is where the real power of the legend lies. We have the official story, and then we have the human one. So, here's my question for you. Which story is more true? The scientific explanation that satisfies our reason, or the ghost story that speaks to our fears? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.